What's up, guys? Today on Sports Spectrum, William Qualkinbush, Clemson University broadcaster, radio host at 97.5 The Roar down in Clemson, South Carolina, a Clemson grad, the Clemson play-by-play voice for their baseball team and their women's basketball team. If you live in the upstate area of South Carolina, you know William Qualkinbush, but he's also a devout follower of Jesus, grew up in the church, father, a senior pastor, and he's in ministry. So I thought, I want to highlight this guy on the show. I like talking to guys and gals who are in the broadcast space, who are in the sports space, but who also love Jesus. We get to do that today with William Qualkinbush from down in Clemson. Can't wait for you to hear that story and his journey coming up in just a moment here on Sports Spectrum. Real quick, want to tell you and remind you about our Sports Spectrum magazine. You can go to Sports Spectrum right now, sportspectrum.com, and subscribe to the magazine. I highly recommend you get a 1-year subscription to Sports Spectrum's magazine if you're looking for faith-filled, family-friendly, clean content, sports content. It's hard to find all of those things, right? Sports content that's faith-friendly, family-friendly. It's almost impossible. Well, that's what we're here for, Sports Spectrum, to help you as you raise your kids, as you teach about Jesus to your family. Well, if they love sports, consider the Sports Spectrum magazine. You can subscribe at sportspectrum.com. Get that 1-year subscription. When you check out, use the code podcast15. It's an exclusive code for you listening to this show. You can get 15% off a 1-year subscription. Again, the code is podcast15, podcast15, and subscribe to a 1-year subscription to the Sports Spectrum magazine. You can do all of that right now. Don't wait. Over at sportspectrum.com. It's great to have William Qualkinbush here on Sports Spectrum. William, what's up, man? Welcome to the show.
Jason, it is an honor and a privilege to be with you. When you reached out and asked me to do this, it was one of the most humbling things, honestly, of my entire life. Just because I love what you're doing and I love what you stand for, and I love listening to you draw out these stories of faith from people in our industry. So I'm very appreciative and humbled by the opportunity.
Well, thank you, buddy. Look, I even wore my Clemson sweatshirt for you today. How about that?
See, that's great. We got off on such a good foot. Like, I couldn't imagine this going any better. It's all downhill from here, right?
Absolutely. Listen, I got to tell you, I'm sad that I didn't meet you, but when I went out to Clemson, it was in the fall of 2022. You may or may not know about this story. And Don Munson was on our podcast a couple of years back. And at the end of the podcast, he just kind of subtly mentioned, hey, Jason, if you ever want to come out to Clemson, let me know. We'll take care of you. And I didn't know if that's real or not. You probably had the same thing happen to you, but people just kind of say, okay. And then you're like, they're not really serious, are they? So I texted him and he said, yeah, come on out and we will take care of you. And I got to tell you, I went to my first trip to Clemson. It was October 2022. We went and saw them play Syracuse in football. And it was a great weekend, perfect weather. And he took care of us and showed us around. And I was hooked. That's why I bought a sweatshirt. Like, I don't have a real favorite sports team. I grew up in upstate New York, so there's not really a lot of great college teams. I guess Syracuse, but I really didn't have a team. So I'm just kind of looking for experiences. And so I have no problem wearing a Clemson sweatshirt today, buddy. I had a great experience in my trip to Clemson.
You know what? I love hearing you say that, and I'm very proud to represent Clemson because that's a lot of people's experience. And let me say about Don too. Don has been great to me. I remember he actually texted me about this the other day. The first trip I ever made with Don, it was a baseball trip like 10 years ago to Georgia State, or I think it was Georgia Southern. And I remember the first big conversation we got into. I have a Baptist background, and he's Presbyterian. And we talked for like an hour and a half about Calvinism and free will. And I've never talked to this guy, like had a big conversation. I'm like, you know what? We're going to be friends, man. And so Don's awesome. I love that.
He is fantastic. Yeah. And that's what I love too, because we didn't really talk a lot about Clemson when we were hanging out. We talked about life and faith, certainly. And I mean, if you want to go as deep as that, we can go there, and that's fun. But, it's also, it shows you the type of guy that he was, that he brought us in and he really took care of us. Like, he showed us around, took us around to all the different hot spots. I couldn't tell you the name of the restaurants we ate at, but I can tell you they were pretty good. That's all I can say. They were
Yeah,
really
you're gonna have a hard time finding a restaurant where it's not good around here.
no,
That's
totally.
just one aspect of Clemson that I think makes it a very unique place.
Absolutely. We're going to talk more about Clemson in a minute and kind of the life that you've lived and growing up there and representing Clemson, like you said. But let's talk about representing Jesus first. I think that's always the best place to start. Tell me about Christ in the life of William Quackenbush.
So I was born in 1989 to mom and dad lived in a great home. I've got a younger brother and two younger sisters. Um, and my dad's always been in ministry. It's always been in the upstate of South Carolina. I was born in Anderson, and I've lived in Greenville and Piedmont and Moonville and places that you couldn't find them on a map. Like you got to be there to know where they are.
I
Where
know
place? I mean,
Greenville.
like
Greenville, at least.
yeah. Greenville's not hard. It's the other one. Like when I say where place, you know exact. Like you could tell who knows where place is by who goes yeah, and people go like you get those blank stares. Even people from the state have no idea.
Yeah.
But so I grew up. My dad was a youth pastor and an associate pastor, and my mom was a teacher, and she took time off to raise us. And that was a really formative part of my life. Just getting to, be discipled at home was neat. And you hear all the stories about preachers' kids like being rebellious and that kind of thing. I'm a people pleaser by nature. I'm a rule follower by nature. And so I just flat missed that. I didn't get in a lot of trouble growing up, and I would like to say it was piety, but I think, well, part of it is just the Lord's hedge of protection, where he's just keeping me out of stuff. But the other thing is just me not wanting to let people down.
Yeah.
And so that was big in terms of just setting me up to understand God's love for me, and that I don't have to please him. I don't want to get too deep in like minute 5 of this podcast, but I don't have to please God. Like he loves me anyway.
That's right.
And my grandma sent me a card, so that's why I remember the day. March 24th, 1995 is when I met Jesus. And I was 5 years old, and my mom, I was I was riding in the car, and I remember asking my mom this crazy story, like, "Hey, when we die, is it like a Looney Tunes cartoon?" I don't know how I said it when I was 5, but I just remember having that thought process, like, in the Looney Tunes cartoons, every now and then, like, somebody gets flattened in their ghost, like, woo, it like goes up into heaven. And I was like, what if it, like, do you just go up, and then when you get to the top, if you haven't confessed all your sins, then you just like keep going, and then you go down and you end up in hell, like you didn't confess fast enough or something. That's the way I was conceiving of it as a 5-year-old. I was a weird kid, Jason.
Well,
And so my mom was able to, yeah, right. So my mom goes, no, that's not right. And she actually walked me into the sinner's prayer.
wow.
And so I believe once saved, always saved. So I was locked up, man. I had a mansion at 5. And ever since then, I've tried my best to follow Jesus, obviously with ups and downs, because one thing that's hard about being a Christian early. I remember I was in part-time youth ministry one time, and I gave this message to our youth group because there was a point in my life where I didn't think I had a testimony, because people that stood up and gave their testimony talked about being saved from stuff. Well, when you get saved at 5, Jason, you're not saved from anything. You don't actually really discover sin until after you're saved. And so
Yeah.
like all the temptations to sin and all the things that can break you down as a believer, I didn't discover those until later in my life. And that always made me feel kind of bad. Like, I was saved. I shouldn't have these struggles. And so that was a big part of like my high school years and my college years, and especially post college, where I'm trying to get out in the world and trying to do ministry and figure that out and pay the bills and just rely on God and get married, find a wife. Like all those things are going on. And I realized that I do have a testimony, because that part of the story is that Christ saved me before I had walked in sin and walked in sin and walked in sin. He locked me up. He bought me with a price. And so that's a part of my story, is that the Lord saved me from living a life in sin, of sin, when I was 5. And so I've had the Holy Spirit in me since then, working, growing, maturing me and stretching me and chastening me. And and rebuking me and encouraging me. So that's a real blessing that my mom was home to be able to do that. And then when I was 11, about 10 or 11, my dad took a job as a senior pastor at a small church in central South Carolina, which is not in the middle of the state. It is right next door to Clemson. And so we lived about 15 minutes from Clemson's campus from my middle school and high school days. If you've seen the movie Pistol, there's this scene where Pete Maravich is walking down the streets of a small downtown dribbling a basketball. The guys in the church I grew up with said that he did that in Central. Like that was where he kind of did that. And so I got to live in the shadows of Clemson University. And so, that's where my relationship with God and my relationship with Clemson sort of started to merge, is that the Lord kind of worked it out where I'm right in the shadows of this place where I've been going to every football game since I was 3 months old. My mom's a 1985 graduate that went to the national championship game in 1982, but after the 1981 season as a freshman. And so the Lord really did, like, he put me right at the doorstep, and just the neat relationships I've been able to build, and the way he's fulfilled the promises that he makes to his people, and the promises of good, not always like good to me, but good for me.
Yeah.
I can look back to so many things that my parents did to set me up for that, and just continue to disciple and grow me. And again, like, I know not a lot of people have this story, but the fact that I had two parents at home investing in me, I had an army around me. My grandparents are believers. My mom's whole family lives very close. There are 10 cousins, all believers, married to believers, kids are believers. And, and a couple of my aunts teach women's ministry, and like I've got elders in churches in my family on that side. So we have a great close bond with a lot of family that also has helped really mature and grow me in the faith. So I could go on about this forever, and I know you don't have forever. But man, I love looking back at the ways that the Lord has set me up to teach me more about Him, and to push me outside my comfort zone, to make me lean on Him a little bit more. It's been awesome.
That's great, man. I love that story. I love that this foundation came because I'm a little jealous when I hear it, to be honest with you, because I think I was 27 when I finally first heard the gospel and responded to it. And I don't even know if I fully understood it, but I knew that my heart was open to say yes and kind of begin this journey with God. So I'm not regretful of the first 20 years of my life. I had a lot of fun, and that's my foundation was built there in other ways. But it wasn't until I was 27. So I feel like when my daughter was born, I was able to get her and have her be in church and hear about Jesus from the time she was able to remember. And very similar to you, she wasn't 5, but she was a little older, probably 8 or 9, when she understood Christ and gave her life to the Lord and got baptized, I think at 9 or 10. And I'm so grateful for that, because that's all she's known. And I didn't have that. So kudos to you, man, because there's a lot of people that, they say as you get older, it becomes harder and harder to understand the gospel or to make decisions to follow Christ, because you're kind of set in your ways. But kudos to you that you were able to grow up in a faith-filled family household.
It is a real blessing, and I'll say, like, I'm jealous again. Like I said, I'm jealous of your story, because I feel like that's the testimony. It's like
Yeah.
everybody that Jesus healed, touched, uh, you know, everybody that he saved physically from something, he saved spiritually from something, and they would go say, "Hey, I was this way, he made me that way, and he's done something neat in me." And I just felt like I never felt that, because at 5, you you don't know how to conceive of that, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
you just don't know what that is. I worked with a guy in radio doing actually football pregame, David Stein, who is a big time radio guy. He was actually, the first time I heard him, I was producing the 6 a.m. show, and so I would be driving in. We were a Sporting News radio affiliate, so I would hear David driving in the mornings, coming in on two wheels at 5:58,
I know
and
his story, by the way. You can go ahead and finish, but his story is incredible.
my gosh, I mean, he's a great mentor of mine, because he's like the opposite. Atheistic Jew,
Hmm.
substance abuse, marital strife, like all that stuff. And Jesus found him in a way, like, he's a pastor. I mean, so like I love how Christ again is like knit us together
Yeah.
because it is like two ends of the spectrum there about how we met Jesus, but now we're in the same family, we're on the same team, we're all part of the same thing, and we can speak the same language and understand the same thing, but with totally different perspectives. So I love that. I know you said you wish you'd had us five. I love the perspective that you have because it takes all of those to like knit the picture of the kingdom of God together.
Yeah. Yeah. And all of our stories matter. That's what's cool. Like your story of being saved at 5 and understanding the gospel at a young age, my story, Mr. Stein's story, anybody's story, they all matter in the kingdom, which is just beautiful. And that's why I love the show that we get to do, because there's so many different uh, stories and journeys that people have gone on that allow us to kind of share, along the way. And I don't like when people say, my story is not this really great story of coming to faith. I grew up as a Christian. I've always known God. And I'm like, no, your story matters. Like, I want to remind people of all levels, like, just because you don't have this, I once was lost, now I'm found, eye opening, moment, it doesn't mean that it's not important in the kingdom. And it is. So, I appreciate you sharing that, man. By the way, I wanted to ask you, did you ever contemplate full-time ministry because dad was a pastor? Because you're in this broadcasting space, and that's kind of a different pivot from ministry, even though it can be viewed that way, I guess.
I did. I will say, like, I was pretty set up to broadcast when I was little. I mean, the story everybody tells is, I remember my mom telling me one time before I did my first women's basketball game for Clemson. I said, this is my first game. My mom was like, no, it's not, because you were broadcasting basketball games, playing video games when you were not. And I would mute the announcers and do my own commentary for my own games. That's again weirdo.
No,
Um,
I
I
relate. I'll just say I relate. This is what I did too, so I relate.
Right. And so, I feel like that gift of gab. Like I always say, I have my dad's volume and authoritativeness in my voice, and have my mom's argumentation skills.
Ah,
My dad hates debating my mom because his style of debate is the loudest wins, and my mom's always trying to win an argument. And I think my wife would tell you sometimes that's not a great thing to be the loudest and want to debate. But I did. I got both of those. And my dad, growing up in the car, like we would listen to like Rush Limbaugh growing up,
yeah.
or we'd listen to sports talk radio growing up, or we'd listen to Christian music growing up. I mean, that's what we did. And so I kind of have all those influences. Like when you're, it's very different to listen to like Dr. James Dobson, Focus on the Family, and then turn on a sports talk show. And I think that's the perspective that I think makes what I do unique in the space, is that I sort of understand what animates people from a sports talk perspective, but I don't want to lose the James Dobson perspective. I don't want to lose that faith aspect. I want people to know that you're going to get, takes, you're going to get opinions, you're going to get emotion from me on the sports side, but you're also going to get that, like, the heart part. You're going to get the faith part. You're going to get the Jesus part in there too. And so I would say that I did contemplate full-time ministry, and the more that I went into sports radio, I realized that that is my full-time ministry now.
Right.
In 2009, this will be a quick story. In 2009, in the fall, I remember, and I'm sorry, I get emotional talking about this because I remember when Jesus pointed out to me, standing on the dike in Clemson, and I'm looking out over the athletic facilities, and it was like, I say it's like Simba and Mufasa, where just everything was illuminated. It was like sunset. It was beautiful and it was illuminated. And I remember just feeling in my heart, this is your ministry. Like, this is your mission field right here. I'm a junior in college. I don't have a clue what that means. I was working in sports information office. I had no idea what that meant. And 15 years later, I'm not a big birthday guy, Jason, but I love celebrating my spiritual birthday. And so
Totally.
every year on my spiritual birthday, I sort of reflect on the past year. And I was reflecting this year, like 15 years ago, 14 and a half years ago, the Lord showed me my mission field, and it was Clemson's athletics complex. That's what it was. And
Hmm.
I'm still doing that. I'm serving students, and I'm serving coaches, and I'm serving fans. And that that to me, every year it crystallizes more and more. Like, this is my ministry. This is my mission field. And there are a lot of times where the job, and I use the term job loosely because I mean it's a blast, man. They
Um,
pay us to do this stuff, but where
yeah.
my job, it gets to be a job, and you get really wrapped up emotionally in it, and you can see how people easily get swayed off track or lose focus on the things that matter. And so every now and then, just to reflect back on like, wow, in October of 2009. Jesus showed me this is where you're going to be. This is what you're going to be doing. And to watch him fulfill that every day, it's awesome. It really is awesome to just think about it from a ministry context like that.
Man, that's a great story. I get chills hearing it myself because you never know fully God's plan until you walk in it and then you look back. And like you say, you spend a moment on your spiritual birthday or other poignant moments and you look back and you just see kind of the Lord directing your steps, even when you can't see it perfectly or clearly, or you're wondering why this road that is supposed to be straight is all windy and up and down.
Mm.
And then you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, God, that's such a perfect plan. I have that with my life certainly as well. When I look back, for you though, I wonder, you see work as ministry. This is a topic I'm actually teaching on at my church as a class, and I'm really fascinated by the idea of work as worship because it took me almost 10 years after I became a follower of Christ before I even thought about working at ESPN as ministry. I was like, this is just a dream job and broadcasting and so much fun in sports. Like they're paying us to do this, like you said. But I never viewed it as ministry until I understood that Christ is at the center of everything I do. So if I'm going into work as a Christian, well, that's where the ministry is. And if I go to the grocery store and shop that day and buy some groceries, well, that's where the ministry is at that moment. And it's kind of like you're in ministry everywhere you go. But then there's opportunities to live out your faith. What's that look like for you? You want to represent Christ well in the work that you do, and certainly represent Clemson well. But what are those moments that you can point to, maybe just one that comes to mind, where you understand that somebody comes to you and says, Qualk, I love what you do. I love listening to you, but I want to hear more about Jesus, or I want to learn more. But do you have a story or just opportunities and moments when you're able to kind of bring faith to the forefront and not just have it be about Clemson's football game on Saturday and if Dabo made the right move or made the right call, et cetera, et cetera?
It's interesting you asked for a moment because I can think of a few like sort of experiences around that. Like I remember one of my favorite shows that was horrible at the time. It was several years ago. I was very young. I was still in my 20s, and I don't know how national this story got. I can't remember, but somebody vandalized Howard's Rock
Oh, yeah.
at
Yeah,
Clemson's
yeah, yeah.
football stadium,
Sure.
and so we did like 3 hours on it one day. And I just distinctly remember this very, like this sense of calm when I went in, that I was not going to ask for this kid who ended up doing it, to be thrown in jail for the rest of his life. And so that entire show, like I don't know where it came from. It's got to be Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I just had this sense of like grace and mercy, and I got crushed. It was 3 hours. Like it was one of the hardest shows I've done because I firmly thought that I was right in doing that, and I really spent a lot of time praying over it that morning, like because that's the kind of show that you can't mess up, right? There's a few shows that you just can't, like from a kingdom perspective, you can't get this wrong. And in my heart, I felt like I was not messing it up, and it was not hitting people. And so I walked away from that show, and I was very discouraged. I was very discouraged. And but in the next few days and weeks, I sort of started to get a better understanding of the Lord being like, okay, this is what I'm showing you about yourself. This is what I'm showing you about myself in terms of the grace and mercy that I've shown you and all this stuff. And so, like, without getting too much into the weeds on that, that was a show where I felt like there was just a lot of reluctance, and I was basically like sledgehammering a brick wall, and there was nothing coming off of it. So that's one example. Like, I think of the world in Bible terms.
Mm.
Like, I'll never forget the first women's basketball banquet I emceed. It was Amanda Butler's first team, which she and I have a great relationship with each other. We would pray before, and she's a former women's basketball coach now. But we prayed before games for the last 2 years. Every single game, even when I wasn't there, with rare exception, I would text her some note or she would text me some note. Like we just had that great bond. But the first year I didn't see the basketball banquet, they had gone to the NCAA tournament for the first time in a decade and a half. And I remember the only analogy that I could come up with was the story in the Gospels where Jesus has resurrected and he asks his followers, they don't know it's him. He's yelling from the beach. It's before the breakfast on the shore. He's announcing to them, hey, why don't you cast your nets on the other side? And it's very similar to what he did before when he's calling fishermen and he says, hey, cast it on the other side. And they're going, dude, we've been doing this. Like, you don't think we thought about that? And then they cast and they reap a bountiful harvest. And so that's what I said to that team in that banquet. That was just it kept coming back to me, kept coming back to me. And so those are the ways that I like to talk about Peter a lot where, in athletics, you see a team that's like raising its level and maybe playing out of their mind. And as long as they continue to sort of walk in the faith that what they're doing is going to be seen or is going to come to fruition, they're fine. It's when they start looking down and they realize what they're doing that the lead starts to shrink and the moment starts to get big and all that stuff. And
Yes.
so those are the ways I try to do that. I try to have these little moments with my audience where I can see, and these little opportunities I can build relationships with coaches and athletes where we can just sort of talk and we can sort of walk with Jesus together. I had a co-host one time that said, you don't have to preach the gospel to other Christians because when you say certain things, they know what you're talking about. There's like a secret language when you talk about stuff that you can look at somebody and go, aha, that guy's got it in here. Like I can listen to Jason Romano, and if I didn't know anything about you, I would say, I bet that guy's a believer in Jesus because of how you use words like joy, how you talk about your experiences. Just it's the way that people come across. And so my goal every day is the best way that I can to come across as someone who has a faith in Jesus Christ that is guiding him through this 3-hour show or guiding him through this 2-hour broadcast. And, if I've got opportunities to, interact with interns, interact with students, I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of like partners, co-hosts, color analysts, that sort of thing, who are believers. And so just to disciple them and to be discipled is really neat too. And, I'm very grateful for all those opportunities.
Yeah, I love that because you got your hands in a lot of different places too, in terms of the role that you do at Clemson. It's not even a role, it's roles, it's multiple roles, multiple hats, which has me a little juiced because I kind of wear a lot of hats in Sports Spectrum because it's really just me and two other guys and teammates that work on our brand. It's not a lot. And I would guess, I know you have more resources than that at Clemson, but not as much because when you're at a school level, you're doing a lot. You're doing it all. You're hosting shows. You're probably producing sometimes. You're like you say, you're play-by-play voice. You're doing all the research. Like there's so much that goes into it. Do you have a favorite of all the different jobs that either you've done? Because I tell people all the time, this job is the most purposeful job I've ever had. Forget ESPN. But my favorite time as a broadcaster was when I was 25 years old. I'm 50 now. When I was 25 and I was just coming up in the business, I was a producer for a local radio show in Albany, New York, news talk, kind of morning zoo show. And I've never had more fun in my life. I was making $16,000. That's $16,000 a year in the late 90s. But I had so much fun with that job and I loved it so much because I was working in business and in broadcasting and somebody was paying me. So for you, what's been your favorite role that you've had in this broadcast journey?
That's a great question. I would say my happy place is a ballpark. Baseball is my favorite. I'm a Cincinnati Reds fan. My dad grew up in Indianapolis,
Yep.
and he played baseball at a Bible college. He played in high school and played at Bible college his freshman year, and he was in Wisconsin. And part of the God story of like setting me up, honestly, is dad hearing the Lord tell him he got saved at 16 and like got immediately called into ministry, went to Bible college, Maranatha Bible College in Wisconsin. And the Lord was telling him like, hey, you need to lay down athletics and just really focus on me. And so he transferred down to Bob Jones here in Greenville to a place where they didn't have sports. They do now, but they didn't at the time. And so without that, he doesn't meet my mom. I don't grow up here, like all that stuff. And so my dad coached me when I was little. And he's still coaching. Like this year, he retired from coaching. He coached eighth grade boys basketball
Yeah.
at R.C. Edwards Middle School. And so all my life, like I have these like very these neat like sights and smells and sounds that just get in my head of like when I was a kid watching my dad coach JV basketball and watching coach baseball and softball and playing t-ball and coaches pitch for him and 12 and under baseball and all that stuff. And so my dad instilled in me a long time ago like you can be a Christian and love sports. And so I really appreciate that perspective from my dad. And because he's a Reds fan, like the best thing ever was when they let you stream the games and we could listen to Reds game. We listen to Marty Brennan.
Yeah.
And I've started doing this. I don't know that I've ever told anybody this, but since Marty, I got to meet him right before he retired. Karen Blackman set me up with him. Karen's a great lady, a woman of faith who works in the industry. And my dad, like we took my dad to a Reds Braves game in Atlanta for Father's Day, and Marty was calling the game, and so my dad got to meet him, listen to him for decades, and me and my brother got to meet him too. And so I have this. There's this romanticism about baseball because you listen to certain people call it, and there's a heart, there's a feel, and so I say this one belongs to Clemson when there are wins because Marty said, and this one belongs to the Reds every time the Reds won. And so I carry that romanticism with me. And so I say all that to say, like, the ballpark is where I think I feel most at home. That's probably my favorite thing to do is to just sit down behind a microphone, see a first pitch, and just see where it takes you for 3 hours or 9 innings or however long it takes. I've done high school football. I did it for 10 years. And I love doing women's basketball, a few opportunities to do men's basketball too. But I just think, like in my bones, I think I feel like baseball and even softball now. Like I love doing softball games. There's just something about those sports that's romantic to me.
I love what your answer is there because you're speaking to my soul. My first love is baseball. Like it just goes back to growing up with a dad who loved the St. Louis Cardinals and still does. My grandfather would always have a game on every single night when I was a kid. We played Little League. Like you said, the same thing. I've never broadcasted baseball per se, but I have gotten to interview and talk to many, many baseball guys. And I just love the sport. I will say this. I'm working with a young man who goes to the college that my daughter attends in Indiana Wesleyan, small Christian school. And he wants to get into this business. And he's 21 years old. And he said to me, his name is Gannon. He said, I love baseball. It's what I would love to do someday. But every one of my suite mates looks at me like I have four heads because it's baseball. Like, why do you love that sport? And I heard that and I got so sad, William, because I'm hoping that the next generation, even the one below you and eventually, your kids or whatever, will still love baseball and want to carry on because I don't know if that's going to be the case. I hope so, but I don't know if the younger generation is in love with baseball the way you and I are.
It's a great question, and I deal with this a lot. The rise of soccer. I think that's something to do with it because a lot of times, like I remember my brother and I, when we were growing up, we played soccer and baseball simultaneously one time, and my parents were like, "Yeah, we're not doing that. We're never doing this again. You got to pick one." And of course, I'm sure Dad was like, "Baseball," like he's probably like whispering that to we're asleep, "Baseball." So we picked the right one. But yes, I think there is something to that. I really think that the powers that be in baseball at the college and the pro level understand that, and they're trying to make the game more palatable. And I will say this about baseball. I think baseball will always have a place in America because there are so many games. Like like if you follow a team, you can miss a game and it's probably okay. But I always say you literally, like you're going to go to the ballpark and see something you've never seen before, and you don't have to break the bank to do it. Like it's
Right.
not cheap to go to a pro game, but because there's 81 home games instead of like 41 for an NBA team or 8 for an NFL team or like 7 for a college football team, you can go without breaking the bank, take your family, and have a nice time. And I'm hoping that casual relationship will continue. I think Major League Baseball investing in local markets has been really helpful with that too. And there are certain places I think where baseball is always going to be like people are going to be more jacked up. Clemson is a great baseball place. It's a great baseball part of the country. I think particularly rural areas, that's a little more attractive. And so like I said, I think it'll always be part of the zeitgeist or part of the, part of the fabric of the nation. But I agree. And listen, Gannon, you said that's his name?
Yeah,
Gannon is the
yeah.
guy's name? Gannon, listen, my first job in baseball, I did some PA work too, but my first job in radio, I was doing solo broadcasts at 19 for a wood bat league uh, at Southern Wesley University, 2 minutes from my house, by myself, friends and family, the only people listening, and I loved it. It was awesome. I love doing that, and so man, any small opportunity you can get to do that, to cultivate that love, if you can show that love and that passion, if you're good at what you do, I think baseball jobs will find you because it is a little bit like it's increasingly more difficult to find people who are that passionate about it.
I agree. And that's what he wants to do, by the way, play by play, which is awesome. So I might even have him and you have a conversation when this podcast is over.
Love to.
He's a
I'd
great.
love to.
Yeah, I love that too. I love pouring into young people. As we wind down, I did want to ask you about young people because I was thinking through not just from a baseball perspective, and that's great, but it's sports, but from a faith perspective, from a Christ-centered perspective. You talk to a lot of young people, having done some ministry in the youth area, but also just being around Clemson and the athletes and talking to a lot of coaches. What do you see as the biggest, I don't know, concern for our youth, for young people, as you see people minister to them as they're growing up in a much different culture than I ever grew up in, much less what you grew up in? What are you seeing as the biggest concern with young people right now?
It's a great question, and it's a hard question because I think ultimately it comes down to that the devil is always going to try to find every single foothold that he can to get in there and draw a wedge between Christ and his creation. It happened in the garden with Genesis 3, and all he had to do was add and subtract a few words from what God said to Eve. He didn't have to tell Eve some exotic thing, right? But he convinced Eve and then also Adam very easily, by the way. Adam was very easily persuaded that it was okay to do the thing that God expressly told them not to do. And so I think sometimes we underestimate, especially like people who've been following the Lord for a while, we underestimate how easy it is, particularly when we're a little more siloed, like COVID really siloed people. And I think it's hard to just smash everybody back together. We're still in silos.
Yeah.
Social media, I know social media is like the big bad wolf. I think one of the great things we can do with social media is redeem it instead of like trying to stiff arm it, because to me, our kids are going to be on it. What do they see? If the Christians retreat, I'm big on this now. My mom is a public school teacher. I got nothing against private school, nothing against homeschool, but my mom's a public school teacher. My brother's been, my two sisters are, my sister-in-law is, and my dad's in public schools right now. Like, we have got to be in this culture, because if not, then the devil is. And
Yeah.
he's gonna grip our kids, man. And I see kids that are distraught. I see kids that are searching. I see kids that are looking for community. And in a lot of ways, it's because that's around the age where you start to realize that your parents' faith is not enough. And you have to decide whether like middle school, high school, college, you start to have to make your own choices in some ways. And I think one thing that we can do as churches is to just encourage kids that they're loved. That's the first thing, that they're loved, and
Yeah.
to let Jesus do the work. One thing that I feel pressured to do as a future parent is for my kids to you know I want my kids to be followers of Christ. I want my kids to be believers, but that is not my role. My role is to show and to tell. My role is not to save. Christ is the Savior. And
Right.
so praying for our kids to be saved by Christ and for us to be a tool to be used. And even then, that's a lot of pressure, man. That's a lot of pressure on parents. It's a lot of pressure on youth pastors. It's a lot of pressure on leaders in the church and people who are impacting kids' lives. But I really think that will help. That because I think heavy-handedness doesn't really, it's not attractive. Trying to really like grip the wheel so hard and like steer our kids, it's not going to work. And instead, allowing the Lord, putting them in places, making church a priority, making discipleship a priority, praying with our kids, reading scripture with our kids, having them see us pray and read scripture, making sure they understand we're showing love and grace and asking forgiveness and those type of things, being a picture that we want. And then I think being present with our kids too, because more and more we see that kids are on their phones because they're by themselves, and that means their parents aren't there with them. And I'm not saying like hover over your kids, but just being intentional about that time that we spend, I think is huge. And I honestly, I think churches have failed our kids too, because I think for adults, particularly adults who don't have kids anymore, like there's a selfishness and a self-centeredness that comes in that the church has got to serve me, when in reality church ain't about me. It ain't about you. It's not about anybody. It's about the gospel of Jesus Christ going forward, which means we've got to be making disciples of the next generation. And we've got to be equipping our kids to be able to do that in the schools and the circles that they walk.
Man, well said. It's on my heart. I serve in our young adults here at the church I attend in Bristol, Connecticut, and that is on my heart every single week when I meet with them. Every single day I see them or talk to them is, man, I just want the next generation to be discipled to know Jesus, and that's what's going to change the world. It's not going to be anything else but that. So I love what you said there. By the way, you mentioned future dad. I'll close with this. You got a little one on the way, don't you?
Yeah, my wife's expecting a daughter very soon, and she's very private. So the fact that she let me talk about it on this podcast that's a real win. I've had people yell at me like for months. People yelling at me. I didn't know that Leah was pregnant, and I would go, did I not tell you weeks ago? Because I haven't had like one-on-one conversations with everybody and like mentally check it off.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we're very excited, and our house is a wreck because we're getting nursery ready and moving rooms. Like we built a house and we thought we knew how the house was going to go, and then we're like, nope, we're just going to change every room. And so now we're doing that. It's exciting, man. I'm 34, and so I got married, when I was 29, and so a little bit later than a couple of my siblings did. And I know a lot of people in the South, like as soon as you like graduate from college, people are like, hey, when you
Yeah.
get married, when you have kids, whatever. And I'm really grateful that the Lord let me wait. And we could probably do another whole podcast on that, because there was a point several years ago where I was working to death. I had people in my life going, you can't work 6 jobs and have a girlfriend. You can't do that. And so I heard the Lord one day. I mean, I'm sure you have a similar story about
Yeah.
starting this journey with Sports Spectrum. Like I heard the Lord say, you got to quit your job, one of your jobs, and then buy a house, which doesn't make any sense. But now I look back on it and say, if I don't quit that one job and I don't buy that house in faith, both times that the Lord's going to provide, He's always provided financially, spiritually, relationally, always provided exactly what I needed. If I don't do that, I probably can't. I don't have the margin to like date my wife, and I don't have the margin to be a father. And so that's really neat. And I appreciate you asking about that, because it does give me a chance to convince my wife that it's okay to talk about it on air with somebody.
Of course. Well, by the time people hear this, it's not going to be too far off from you actually having had your child. So I want to make sure people understand that by the time they hear this, you probably have already talked about it with other people. So I'm glad that you're willing to talk about it here. And by the way, you're going to have a daughter. My wife and I have one child. We have a little girl who's not little anymore. She's 20 and in college. And as much as I thought I wanted to be a dad to a boy, and if you get to have that blessing of being a dad to a son someday, I'm sure you'll have a great experience there. But there is nothing like having a daughter. That's all I'm going to say. There is nothing like having a little girl.
That's what everybody says. Everybody's like, "You're gonna be a great girl, Dad." I'm like, "Well, I'm glad y'all are sure. Appreciate that. Any advice, any insight into why you think that would be amazing."
You can take her to Clemson games and you can take her to Reds games and you can have the same experiences, because I thought that was the case. I'm like, oh, she's not going to like sports. Oh, yeah. I want to bet. She played softball. She played volleyball. We watched the Mets together, sadly, because they stink, but we watched the Mets together and we love sports, and it's just awesome. So, yeah, you're going to be a great dad, man. You're going to have a great experience. I'm excited for you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the encouragement there. And my little girl is not like, she's not going to have any way whatsoever to avoid a ball field, because I always, my life. This is a weird analogy, but the Pirates of the Caribbean Jack Sparrow compass that always points toward what you want. I've always told people my compass points toward Clemson, Clemson people, Pickens County in South Carolina, until it doesn't. And so until it doesn't, that's what she's going to see, and that's what she's going to hear, and that's what I'm going to be about.
Absolutely. And she will be loved immensely by that Clemson community, I'm sure. William Qualkinbush. Listen, this was fantastic. Loved the conversation. Loved having you on. We'll definitely do it again. And maybe I'll come back down in person and we can have a chat that way as opposed to doing it over the internet. So I appreciate you, man. Thanks for joining us.
Jason, it has been an honor and a privilege to be with you. God bless you and your ministry. You're in my prayers, seriously. And just thank you so much for what you're doing and highlighting people who I can look up to as voices for Christ in our profession. So thank you very much for what you're doing. And I'm so glad to be with you.
And many thanks to William Qualkinbush for joining us here today on Sports Spectrum. He's awesome guy, has a great story. As a broadcast guy myself, I liked hearing his journey of broadcasting, but definitely how that's intersected with faith and how Jesus is the most important thing in his life. Loved hearing William Qualkinbush here on the show today. We hope you did too. Make sure you go check out our website, sportspectrum.com, for all of our content. You can find our articles there and great stories on the intersection of sports and faith. We got a 5-day daily devotional Monday through Friday that you can sign up for. You can have that delivered right to your email inbox if you'd like, or you can go check it out at sportspectrum.com. And then, of course, all of our podcasts are there. This podcast today is right there on the website, sportspectrum.com. And I'm guessing you're probably listening to this podcast on a different app, like Apple or Spotify or, Amazon or iHeartMedia. Wherever you're listening to this podcast on, please do us a favor and click subscribe or click follow. That way you don't miss any more conversations like today's with William Qualkinbush. And I just believe when you subscribe, you can have that thing delivered right to your phone, and then you don't have to worry about going and searching for specific conversations or clicking some link here or there. It's right there in your podcast feed, the Sports Spectrum podcast, keeping Jesus in the sports conversation. We do love you guys. We appreciate your support, and thank you for tuning in. We hope you'll join us next time for another conversation here on the show. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Hey, thanks for watching Sports Spectrum here on YouTube. You can click our next video, or you can check out our website, sportspectrum.com.